Hi everyone, it's Morgan again. Welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited about today's video because today I'm going to do that classic YouTube thing and rank all of Vladimir Nabokov's books. So on this channel, we stan Vladimir Nabokov, and after I've read all of his books, I can confidently say that Nabokov is my favorite writer, and I think he is the greatest English language writer of all time. And I feel like it's great to be a Vladimir Nabokov fan because he gave us so much. He's not just a novelist, he wrote nonfiction, he wrote short stories, he wrote poetry, he even wrote plays. And yet today, what we're going to do is we're going to try and narrow down the huge corpus of his works and just rank his major books. So before we get into the ranking, let's talk about the actual books that are in scope for this exercise. As you can see from the timestamps, this is going to be a long video, and that's just because he wrote a lot of stuff. Nabokov wrote 17 finished novels or novellas, books that are published on a standalone basis, not as a short story. These are the ones you might find in any bibliography of any of Vladimir Nabokov's books at the front or the back of the work. Other works by Nabokov, they'll list his completed novels there. And to these 17 completed novels, we also have to add a few extra books. The first book we're going to add is Speak Memory, and that's just because Speak Memory is so good and so artistic, even though it is a nonfiction memoir slash autobiography, that it deserves to be on this list. And I think no corpus of Nabokov works is complete without Speak Memory. The second book we're adding to this list is Nabokov's collected short stories. So he published 4 volumes of 13 short stories during his life. And then after he died, his estate published a omnibus volume with all of the short stories he published during his life, even the ones that weren't collected into a previous volume. I'm counting that as a finished work because even though Nabokov didn't personally collate all of those short stories, he did publish them in various periodicals throughout his life. So we're pushing all of them together into one volume as they are collected today. The third book that we're adding to this list of 17 novellas and novels is The Enchanter. This is sometimes called a short story. It's included in the list of short fiction in this works by Vladimir Nabokov at the front of this particular copy of The Eye. But sometimes it's considered a standalone novella. It's about 100 pages, slightly less than 100 pages long. And the reason I'm including it is just because you can buy it as a separate volume. It's going to look, somewhat like The Eye. The Eye is about 100 pages long, and it's published separately than his other short stories. It's not included in the collected volume of short stories, for example. And because he did finish it during his lifetime, even though he didn't publish it, we are including it in this list. And the fourth and last work that we're adding to the list of 17 novels and novellas is Nabokov's Lolita screenplay. So this one doesn't get a lot of press just because it is just a version of Lolita, but I think it is unique enough from the novel version of Lolita that it justifies being on this list. And moreover, Vladimir Nabokov actually did publish it. He published it independently in 1973, so it is a major authoritative Nabokov work. Okay, so this is the full list of 21 books that we're going to be covering in this video. It's a lot, and the last thing I will say before we dive in is just that this is my personal ranking. I am not trying to judge these by any objective measures. Nabokov is a artiste. He can't be put into a box, and I'm just going to be using my own subjective criteria to judge each book individually based on its own idiosyncrasies, and the ranking is my personal opinion. So please feel free to leave your opinions about Nabokov's works, your personal ranking, down in the comments below. I look forward to every single one of your comments, and if you like this video, I'll just say for the first time on this channel, give me a like, send me a comment. I read every one of them. I really appreciate it. Okay, with that out of the way, let's begin. Number 21 on my list is Ada or Ardor. Shots fired, I know. I feel like I'm gonna get some flack for ranking this last, but I'm standing by it. Ada or Ardor is my least favorite Vladimir Nabokov book, and I also think it is his objective worst. This book is about a brother and a sister named Ada and Von Veen. They are full-fledged siblings, but they're kind of raised as cousins, and they engage in a romantic and sexual relationship that starts in their childhood and lasts throughout all of their lives. But the main action of the novel, the majority of it, takes place when they are children or early adults, like in their teens and 20s, essentially. The subject matter, incest, that doesn't bother me. I can take Lolita. I'm not going to be grossed out by a bit of incest. The thing that I really take issue with in Ada or Ardor is the writing style. This is Nabokov at his most convoluted, at his most dense, at his most deliberately inaccessible. And I think that is such a departure from the rest of his oeuvre, which is remarkably easy to read, remarkably funny, and yes, accessible for a reader who is not from the same culture that he is, who perhaps doesn't have the same background in Russian literature or in continental European literature. But Ada or Ardor relies on an extensive knowledge of the literary and historical references that Nabokov would have been familiar with. You better understand French before you go into this novel, or you are going to have a tough time. Also, it'd be good if you had Russian, a little bit of German too. Italian couldn't hurt either. All of those languages feature in Ada or Ardor, and don't expect the translations to be right there for you either. I believe after the initial printing, Vladimir Nabokov was convinced to provide footnotes or endnotes in the guise of Vivian Darkbloom at the end of subsequent copies of Ada or Ardor. However, I did not get one of those copies. This is an early trade paperback. There are no endnotes. I had to just go in there with a very elementary understanding of French and just try to decipher it. So maybe some of this is on me. But that being said, I do think Nabokov was being deliberately abstruse, deliberately difficult here, because he wrote Ada or Ardor when he had already made it. Lolita had come out to great acclaim, Pale Fire had come out to great acclaim. They had just made a movie of Lolita, and then he moved to Montreux, Switzerland with the royalties from all of those successes and started writing for himself. And that's why this book just leaves so many readers, including myself, behind. He's not trying to appeal to any audience. He's just writing for himself. He doesn't think he needs to bow to any conventions of literature like compelling characters or dramatic tension or a plot that moves at a pace that makes sense. And so you get some weird sections of this book which really slog, which are very, very difficult to get through. I think the first 30 pages are famously hard to get through, and then towards the end there's like another 20 pages which is just like him philosophizing through the mouth of Von Veen, the main character in this novel. I honestly cannot recommend this to anyone. The subject matter, a little unappealing, fine, but it's really the writing style that I can't abide. Okay, so that was rank 21, Ada, and now I'm going to move to rank 20, which is The Defense. Another one that is kind of a fan favorite and that I don't think is very good. I'm rating The Defense down here at rank 20 simply because I feel like he does it better. Nabokov does it better in his later novels. The Defense is the first time that Nabokov creates the obsessive, deluded main character archetype whose obsession is the cause of his own downfall. And he revisits this idea in The Eye and Despair in Lolita and Pale Fire. He revisits it multiple times throughout his career, but The Defense is the first time he does that, and it's with a chess grandmaster named Luzhin. This book made a big splash in the 1930s in the Russian emigre community, but Nabokov clearly wasn't done with this idea. He revisits it over the course of his career. And when I look back at the defense, I feel like it's a bit too straightforward. Like there's not enough nuance in the concept in this obsessive narrator who causes his own destruction idea. It's kind of just played straight. Whereas in other novels, Nabokov tries to engage the reader a bit more. He's more active in the unreliableness of the narration. Whereas in the defense, there's no real unreliable narration. It's just a guy slowly going crazy. That being said, the defense is still pretty readable and can be enjoyable. They did make a movie out of it, so tells you a little bit about the popularity of this book. And I would rate it a solid 3 star. So we're jumping from 1 star Ada to 3 stars with defense, and everything is going to be higher than that the further up we go. At number 19 is Invitation to a Beheading. I've talked about this book before in my video about Nabokov's short novels, and this one is about a man who is condemned to death because he's just unlike anyone else in the world that he lives in. He's the only one who has an imagination. You might say he's the only one who has a soul. Whatever he has or doesn't have, everyone else is very uncomfortable because of this, and so they condemn him to death. This is an absurdist work. It is a work of allegory. It is very similar to Kafka's The Trial. I don't really jive with absurdist or Kafka-esque literature, I've discovered, so I didn't really connect with this book. And moreover, Nabokov really isn't a novelist of social ideas or social messaging. He always disdained the literature of ideas. He talked about that extensively. So he didn't like books that drove home a message. And yet, how else are we going to interpret Invitation to a Beheading? It's an allegory. It is definitely a message driven kind of work. So I'm just a little bit baffled as to why Nabokov ranked this book, Invitation to a Beheading, so high in his personal list of favorite books. I have the same critique for number 18 on this list, Bend Sinister. I have a copy of Ben Sinister in this omnibus volume. It's got 3 of his works. This is the Library of America edition of novels and memoirs, 1941 to 1951. So this is my only copy of Ben Sinister, squished in the middle between The Real Life of Sebastian Knight and Speak Memory. And that's okay because I don't really revisit Ben Sinister. Ben Sinister is even more of a message-driven work than Invitation to a Beheading. This is about a totalitarian state somewhere in Europe that slides into dictatorship and tyranny, into a combination of Stalin and Hitler. Obviously, it's political. Nabokov clearly was thinking of the disasters that had happened in Europe when he was writing this in the 1940s. That's not hard to imagine. What bothers me is just that this is so overtly social messagey. I agree with Edmund Wilson, who said that this is not Nabokov's kind of subject. It's not his strong suit. Stick to the interpersonal conflicts and the illicit relationships and the love triangles and the murder, and don't do the social message or societal conflict level type books. I don't think Ben Sinister succeeds as a social message type work. The best parts of Ben Sinister are the interpersonal dynamics. There are humorous and tragic interpersonal scenes that are not necessarily driven by the wider societal issues going on in the background, and those are the most interesting, I think. Number 17 is Transparent Things. We're now getting into the range of books that I liked and I enjoyed, and I probably had fun when I was reading them, but I wouldn't consider them his best works. I wouldn't consider them something I would revisit, not as a whole at least. I remember some scenes from them very fondly, but overall, I just don't think they're truly excellent. Transparent Things, solidly one of this category. It's fun, it's relatively easy to read, it's got classic Nabokovian concepts, the unreliable narrator. There's a non-chronological, non-linear narrative. It's funny sometimes in a Nabokovian way. It recycles a lot of like the best of Nabokov, but I just feel like he was kind of fading. This is one of his last works. It doesn't show him off to best effect, I think. At number 16 is The Enchanter. I put this into the same bucket as Transparent Things, in the sense that I enjoyed it while reading it, but would I go back to it? Not necessarily. And that's because The Enchanter is clearly the sketch for Lolita. If you read Lolita and then you read The Enchanter, you're like, oh, clearly Nabokov had this idea in mind of a man who would marry a woman just to have access to her daughter because he's a pedophile and he's kind of like struggling a little bit in himself, but he also really wants just to get access to that girl. You can tell that Lolita is the final and complete and greatest version of that artistic idea. And The Enchanter is very short. It's just a part of that idea. It doesn't have the same fireworks that the real Lolita does. Everything that the Enchanter does, Lolita does better. And also, Nabokov clearly didn't prioritize translating The Enchanter because he was translating all of his other works in the last part of his life, making sure his Russian works got put into English under his supervision, but he didn't do The Enchanter. So maybe that is a mark of the quality of The Enchanter as evaluated by Nabokov as well. Moving on to number 15, we have Look at the Harlequins. I actually really have a soft spot for Look at the Harlequins. It is a funny book. This falls into the lineage of humorous Nabokov. There's a few ones on this list that are primarily funny, and I think Look at the Harlequins is primarily a funny one. The reason why it's not any higher on this list is because you kind of need to know the rest of Nabokov's corpus in order to get Look at the Harlequins. This is a very self-referential work. It refers to Nabokov's own life and his other published novels. Look at the Harlequins was his last novel, and it's kind of fitting because it's kind of a retrospective, but a parodized retrospective of his own life. So I couldn't really recommend this to anyone except a Nabokov diehard, someone who's already read a lot of his other works. At number 14, we have Glory. So as we get higher and higher up toward number 1, I have more and more physical copies of Nabokov's books. I read a lot of them via audiobook or in a digital copy, and I borrow them from the library. And then if I really like them, I buy myself a physical copy of the book for keeps, you know. And Glory, I have a real soft spot for, even though I do think it is not a great book overall, but there are scenes in Glory that stand out to me and that I do revisit just because they're so evocative and so beautiful. The plot is barely there. This is really just a mood book. It's running on vibes. This novel follows a young man, a Russian emigre, very similar to Nabokov himself, surprise, surprise, who moves to Western Europe, spends time in Cambridge, spends time in Berlin, does some of the same things that Nabokov did in his own early 20s. And I really just like reading about Nabokov's youth. I could listen to Nabokov talking about his childhood and his youth forever. And so I think I'm just really susceptible to a narrative like this that meanders, that doesn't necessarily drive to a conclusion, but is just so lovely and warm and beautiful. And it falls into a lineage of Nabokov books. This is the first one we're going to encounter, which I'm going to call soft Nabokov, which means that he's not cynical. There's like two different versions of Nabokov in his novels. There's the hard, cynical Nabokov of Laughter in the Dark and Lolita and Despair and Look at the Harlequins. And then there's the soft, confessional, not tricksy, very warm and open, almost vulnerable Nabokov of Glory and The Gift, and we'll see a few other examples down the line. I have a big soft spot for Glory, in particular for the descriptions of train travel. If you like trains, I mean, I like trains a lot. I love this romantic feeling of being on a sleeper train across Europe to the south of France, and there is a lot of train travel in Glory. So moving on to number 13, I'm ranking King, Queen, Knave, but I also want to talk about number 12 simultaneously, which is going to be Laughter in the Dark. So King, Queen, Knave and Laughter in the Dark are very similar novels. They are both part of Nabokov's Berlin thriller period. He wrote these two within 4 or 5 years of each other. They came out in 1928 and 1932 respectively. Both of them revolve around nasty love triangles among Germans. I find this very interesting to speculate on because at this time, Nabokov was living in Germany, he was living in Berlin, he wasn't particularly comfortable, and he really had no respect for the host country, the Germans who were living around him, and that disdain and scorn would develop into hate later on because of Nazi Germany and the fact that his brother died in a concentration camp, etc. King, Queen, Knave, and Laughter in the Dark show how cruel Nabokov can be when playing ruthlessly with characters that he doesn't consider to be similar to himself or to be within his circle of people. None of the people in Laughter in the Dark or King, Queen, Knave are aristocratic or noble, even in the mind. They are low, vulgar, working class people or bourgeoisie people, aka who are not like Nabokov himself, right? Because he's like above all that. And while it's fun to read about their squabbles, their lusts after each other, the way they try to hurt each other, and the way they are just cruel to each other, it is a nasty kind of fun. So I'm ranking them both at 13 and 12. I'm ranking Laughter in the Dark slightly higher than King, Queen, Knave, just because I do think it's a little bit tighter. It's a little bit more suspenseful. I felt more scared and thrilled when reading Laughter in the Dark than King, Queen, Knave, but both of them are just very solid. I would say 4-star books. They are probably not the most ambitious Nabokov, but they are still great and fun to read anyway. At number 11, I am ranking Lolita the Screenplay. I actually think Lolita the Screenplay is like the lost Nabokov masterwork. It is written right at the height, the pinnacle of Nabokov's career in 1959 and 1960. He had just published Lolita and he had been approached by Stanley Kubrick to write the screenplay version for his film. And he was about to start on Pale Fire. And then in this like pivotal pinnacle moment, Nabokov chose to go back to Lolita and give us more in the universe of Lolita. In the screenplay, you have new scenes, new dialogue, a new perspective on the mysteries of the novel version of Lolita. Maybe if you read Lolita once and you didn't catch everything, the screenplay will lay that out for you. He's much clearer because he's trying a different thing. He's trying to be a director. He's trying to give you multiple perspectives. The camera moves in different ways. I think it's a really cool experiment. It's a cool mental picture you can get in your head when you're reading the Lolita screenplay. And I just think it's so awesome that we have bonus Lolita content from Nabokov. All right, we're in the top 10. I pretty much love everything from here on out, but we're going to start off with the collected short stories of Nabokov. I'm not holding up the collected short stories, that is a massive tome, but I do have this portable Nabokov, which has 11 of his short stories, as well as some other works, and includes some of my favorite short stories too. So I do go back to the short stories. I know it's a little bit weird to rank all of his short stories in the same line item. The guy wrote over 60 short stories during his lifetime. Depending on which volume you get of the collected short stories, you might get 65 or 68. They find a new one every couple of years, and then they just publish a new edition of the omnibus short stories. but I'm really ranking his collected short stories on the basis of the best of the best. I think the best of the best is going to be on par with his novels, but in any collection of over 60 works, you know you're not going to have bangers all the time. There are some duds in here. There are some short stories that I don't resonate with, that I just think were dashed off relatively quickly or a little bit immature. Most of his short stories were written originally in Russian, so they might deal with a milieu that we readers of today are unfamiliar with. But I think the best of his short stories stand the test of time. I'm thinking in particular of Spring in Fialta, which is included in this volume, and it is my all-time favorite Nabokov short story. I love Spring in Fialta. I have some lines from it memorized. I actually do revisit it from time to time. And there are other great ones in the list, such as Tyrants Destroyed, Lick, The Vane Sisters is very good. Nabokov was a great short story writer, and he moved away from it in order to focus on his novels in the 50s and 60s. But the short stories, particularly in the late 30s, they are still amazing. I would rank them 5 stars on their own. At number 9, we have Pnin. And I just want to make a note that looking over my list of top 10, I feel like a lot of his American era works, aka the books that were originally written in English, feature in the top 10 than his Russian language works. And that's just because I'm biased. I am not a reader or speaker of Russian. I'm sure if I read Russian, I would rate his original Russian works higher on this list. But this is a subjective list. I don't claim to rate anything objectively. But what I think is super cool about Nabokov and what makes him unique in the entire world is that you can approach his oeuvre from the Russian side or from the English, the Anglophone side. And both versions of those books are authoritative because he was fluent in both languages and he supervised the translations, or he translated himself versions of his books from both languages into the other language. He translated Lolita into Russian himself, for example. He translated Despair and Laughter in the Dark into English himself, for example. So you have 2 authoritative versions of all of his books in which the jokes and the puns and the references are preserved and modified to be more accessible to each audience, the Russian-speaking and the English-speaking audience. That's just a cool note about Nabokov. Let's get back to Pnin. A lot of people say Pnin is right up there with Lolita just because it was written pretty much simultaneously with Lolita. But Pnin, of course, is the soft side of Nabokov. This is his funny side, his warmth, his nostalgia and vulnerability are on show here. We follow Timofey Pnin, an emigre and professor of Russian literature who is a fish out of water and is just bumbling around in tragic and also humorous exile. It's very readable. Again, it is part of the lineage of funny and soft Nabokov, but I do think the stakes in it are relatively low. For example, nobody dies in Pnin. Nobody's like scheming to murder anybody. There's no horrible, horrible pain. There's just sort of like tender pain. And that I think is in contrast to the next book on this list, which is The Real Life of Sebastian Knight. The stakes are definitely higher in the real life of Sebastian Knight. Sebastian Knight has just died. We are on his trail. We are trying to figure out who he is. The question is posed by the title here. What is the real life of Sebastian Knight? There is just more urgency and drive in this novel than in Pnin, I think, which is, I admit, a matter of taste. But the thing that I particularly love about the real life of Sebastian Knight is this concept of identity and reality. I love this theme. This is my favorite theme, the idea that identity, one's own vision of oneself, is only comprehensible through a subjective narrative. So there's no real life. No one can touch on the real life of Sebastian Knight. We only have a multiplicity of reflections of ourself depending on who is telling the story. I love the concept here. I think the twists and the language in this book are excellent. A real favorite of mine, The Real Life of Sebastian Knight. At number 7 is Despair. This is a masterpiece of unreliable narration. It's right up there with Lolita. The narrator of this novel, Herman, finds a man, a hobo, that he thinks looks exactly like himself, and he just spirals into obsession. If we compare Despair against the Defense, for example, we can see how far this archetype of the self-deluded, obsessive main character has developed since its first appearance in the Defense. In Despair, you have much more reader engagement. Instead of a third-person narrative, you have first-person narration that challenges you as the reader to see beyond what the narrator is saying. There is a game in Despair, and I love that about this book. What I love in particular is that Nabokov is challenging you, but he's not going so far as he will later in Pale Fire, for example, where he doesn't provide you any answer at the end of the book, where there's like a deliberate absence of the real truth. But in Despair, there is a real truth. There is like a mystery that is unraveled at the end. One of the things that I admire about Nabokov in general is his ability to blend these high art concepts, like the concept of identity and the subjectivity of reality, with elements of genre fiction or popular fiction, in the sense that there is a mystery here. There is crime in this novel, and that keeps you as a reader on the edge of your seat. It makes you want to turn the page, whereas if it were only about these esoteric, big-ass themes, you might get a little bit bored, you might let your attention wander, but he pairs the big-ass themes with a fast-moving plot and with mystery and with sentences that draw you in, that challenge you and end in unexpected ways, which makes the entire reading experience like very satisfying on both a high art level and on a low art level. At number 6, I'm ranking Mary. I love Mary. I feel like I'm the only person who would rank Mary this high because Mary is his first novel. It's very short. It's a novella. Some people would call it immature, which might be true. But at the same time, personally, I have a huge soft spot for soft Nabokov. I like Glory a lot, even though it has its flaws. I love Mary, even though it might not display the same fireworks of language as later Nabokov. It's about a guy, a Russian emigre, living in Berlin, per usual, who is reminiscing over his first love, Mary. And so he's reliving these memories, and all around him as he's living in squalid and kind of low conditions in Berlin, a city, again, that Nabokov didn't respect, he's also living in his past, and the past is magical. Unlike the rest of Nabokov's corpus, that past is not tragic. It's nostalgic without being sad, which I think is really cool. The ending of Mary is actually hopeful, which I love. I also love the setting of Mary, the Berlin boarding house. Everything feels very gritty. The boarding house is right next to a train line, so that when the train rushes by, all the windows fill up with this train and everything rumbles. And you really get the sense that everyone here is in between stations in life. They're moving from one station in life to another station in life. They're kind of hustling, they're on the make, they're just trying to get by. It feels very down to earth, which is a unique thing in Nabokov's corpus, and I really appreciate. At number 5, we have The Eye. I love the Eye even more than Mary. And yeah, I'm honestly probably the only person who would ever rank the Eye this high. It's a novella. It's like really short and tiny. Maybe some people would call it a minor work. I would say it is everything that I love about Nabokov all rolled up into one little ball. It's got the funny, the dialogue, the wordplay, the action. It's got the unreliable narrator and the ruminations on what is reality, what is identity, the big questions and the little questions all together. I'll tell you what it's about. It's about a Russian emigre living in Berlin as usual, and he's having an affair with a woman, and the woman's husband finds out and beats the shit out of our main character here. And then our main character is like so embarrassed and feels so defeated that he's going to kill himself. He tries to commit suicide, but that happens at the very beginning of the novel. And the rest of the novel is this weird after death vision, perhaps. We don't quite know. I guess you'll find out by reading this book. But the rest of the novel happens purportedly after our main character dies. I can't describe it anymore without giving too much away. You just got to read it. I feel like it's severely underrated. I love The Eye. Okay, guys, we're at top four. All of these books are 5 stars, excellent. I love them all for different reasons. I revisit them frequently. It just depends on what I'm in the mood for in a particular day. But today we have The Gift. The Gift is at number 4. This is a life-affirming, happy book, a light, bright, and beautiful gem. I feel like every time people talk about The Gift, they can only describe it in this sort of abstract way, so I'll try to give you a more concrete description of it. We follow a young Russian emigre in Berlin. Surprise, surprise. His name is Fyodor, and Fyodor is trying to make it as a writer. This is really the novel of Nabokov coming into his own as a writer in the 1920s in Berlin. It's very autobiographical, although Nabokov will dramatize and fantasticize things that are based in his real life. And it is a soft Nabokov book. This is a book about finding happiness, about discovering and going after your calling in life, about finding true love. Yeah, it's just very life affirming, very warm and vulnerable. And I love that aspect of Nabokov. The passages in here, there are some that I frequently go back to. There are poems embedded in The Gift that I have memorized and I recite frequently just because they're so good. They're like some of Nabokov's best poetry is in The Gift. So yeah, this one frequently gets top honors and I think it's well deserved. It is a great book. All right, hey guys, it's the next day. I'm down to the top 3. I had to break up this recording into 2 days just because it was taking so long. But let's finish up this ranking with number 3, which is Lolita. So Lolita, we all know about Lolita, right? It's Nabokov's most famous book. It's the one that has been made into 2 movies. If you've read any Nabokov, you probably have started with Lolita, and it is undeniably good. It's a modern classic. I started with Lolita and I liked it enough to go on with the rest of Nabokov, although my love affair with Nabokov really didn't kick off until I read Pale Fire. And it still holds up. I still have very fond feelings about Lolita. I still think it's a work of genius. My issue with it today is really driven by my engagement with Nabokov over the past several years as I've kept reading about him and I've kept reading the analysis of him. So secondary materials, people talking about Nabokov, that I've developed this problem with the readership of particularly Lolita. Unfortunately, I've kind of let the reception of this book kind of spoil my own reading of it now, such that now it's only number 3. And the reason why is because I think the majority of people who read Lolita, and anytime you talk about Lolita with any group of people, or if you read an article about Lolita, extending even to the academia about Lolita, people read Lolita as a book with a moral. And the moral is pedophilia is bad. Humpert Humpert is the villain. You're not supposed to like or sympathize with or, humanize the narrator of this book in any way. And I just hate that kind of analysis. I feel like it is so reductionist to flatten the complexity of this huge novel into a pamphlet sized line, oh, pedophilia is bad. Nabokov was clearly trying to do more than just tell you that pedophilia is bad, or worse, show you in some kind of social educator role how pedophiles think, or even shed light on the plight of victims of child abuse or victims of rape. I detest this kind of utilitarian driven reading of books, especially given Nabokov outright told you in the afterword that Lolita is not supposed to have a moral and he's not a writer of didactic fiction. And I know Nabokov's interviews are not to be trusted because he's always playing tricks with you, but I still want to give that line the benefit of the doubt. The attempt to read Lolita not first and foremost as a moral tract, as a morality play, as a moral test, God forbid. I want to see it as an artistic achievement. I want to appreciate it for the complexity that it offers without reducing it to some easy take home message. So nowadays, I do still revisit Lolita. I reread it from time to time. It still offers non utilitarian pleasures, but I feel like my engagement with Lolita is very private now. I don't really talk about it. I try not to seek out commentary on Lolita in any media, primarily because I think my reading of it is kind of at odds with the broader reading of it, so I need to keep that appreciation private. Coming in at number 2 is my favorite novel of all time, Pale Fire. Pale Fire truly kicked off my Nabokov journey. I feel like still, even after 2+ years, I go back to Pale Fire and I haven't exhausted it. This is the work that has everything. It touches on all of the big questions, and it also doesn't skimp on the mundane delights. Just the sheer reading of it provides word by word beauty. And I've talked about Pale Fire before in another video on my channel, so I'll just use this opportunity to talk more about my personal development with Pale Fire, how my reading of Pale Fire has changed over the years. So when I started reading Pale Fire, I think I interpreted it in the standard way, which is that the poem, the 999 line poem, written by John Shade, that is at the heart of Pale Fire, is kind of the voice of reality, the voice of convention. Maybe it's a little cliched, but at the end of the day, that is the voice we are supposed to see through the confusing commentary into. And I viewed the commentary by the mad commentator Kinboat as the voice of unreality, the voice of fancy and fantasy, taken to the extreme, the voice of obsession. And Nabokov is kind of throwing up this voice as a shield between you and the real core of the book, which is Pale Fire the poem. But now, after many rereads and going back through Pale Fire, I feel like the lines between reality and unreality and mundanity and fancy really aren't so clear cut as the line between poem and commentary that is in Pale Fire. There are moments where you can tell that John Shade definitely was inspired by Charles Kinboat. It's independent even of Kinboat's boasting himself in the commentary. There are moments where you can tell that John Shade kind of exhibits the fancy and the type of inventive thinking, maybe just, yeah, maybe even the obsession that Charles Kimboat exhibits in the commentary. It's just disguised in a different way. This is just one example of the myriad ways in which this book never has a bottom. It is an inexhaustible source of joy and literary delight. You can find joy in the verbal texture of it or in the semantic meaning of it, whatever meaning you want to derive from it. I hold this book up as the pinnacle of what a novel can be. It can be both something that is very deep and touches you and touches your view of the world, as well as a book that just makes you happy on a minute by minute basis, something that, again, is a non utilitarian delight. And that, my friends, brings us to number one. And number one is Speak Memory. Yeah, Speak Memory, not even a fiction book, but a nonfiction, is my favorite Nabokov. My version of Speak Memory is in this Library of America edition right now because I've lent out my independent copy of Speak Memory. But I've talked about this book before on my channel, and so again, I'll just use this opportunity to talk more about my personal relationship with Speak Memory. I admire Speak Memory not just for the beauty of the language and the insights into Vladimir Nabokov's adolescence and childhood, which is what the subject of Speak Memory is. It is an autobiography going from his earliest memories until about the age of 40. But I primarily admire Speak Memory, or I've come to admire it, as an embodiment of an artistic project, which is the pulling out of themes from one's own life and organizing them, creating order out of chaos using one's imagination or using one's artistic powers, which is what Nabokov does in Speak Memory. He characterizes it as almost a godlike power because it is creating meaning out of nothing. It's creating something where there originally is nothing. When I realized it, when I saw what he was doing, it transformed the way that I viewed life and the way I viewed consciousness. The first lines of Speak Memory are iconic. He talks about life being just a brief crack of light in between two eternities of darkness, in between non existence and non existence. And while that is a very scary and daunting idea, I don't think Nabokov views it as such. I think he views that crack of light that is our human life and our human consciousness as an opportunity to find endless joy in fancy, in the powers of our imagination, in interpreting what we might think of as arbitrary, perhaps something ugly, something definitely, not very artistic, into something artistic. And what is art? I mean, for Nabokov, I feel like he would call art a godlike power, the power to create meaning out of nothing. So that is my personal interpretation of Speak Memory, and why I've held it so close to my heart after all of these years. It's kind of a comfort read for me. It's kind of even like a guidebook or like an example of what a person can do with their life. If you look at the objective facts of Nabokov's life, he suffered a lot of tragedy, particularly in the first half of his life. But you wouldn't know it from reading Speak Memory. The guy had a positive outlook and he was always willing to see happiness in everything, which is one of those capacities that I want to carry in me personally through my own life. Okay, so this is the final list of all of Nabokov ranked. This is my subjective list. If you have any thoughts, take any issue with anything I've said here, I welcome your comments below. I hope this video has inspired you to read or reread Vladimir Nabokov. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.